Thank you all, and particularly Panos, for the invitation today. It is a real pleasure to be here, and it's a fantastic opportunity to get out into the real world and hear what's actually happening out in the environments that we research. I'm an occupational psychologist, but I'm based at the University of Hull in Newburyport Centre for Human Factors. And we've got lots of very exciting work going on. But as academics, it's very easy to get into a sort of tunnel of the literature and the academic work. So myself and Steffi, my colleague who's going to speak next, try very hard to get out speaking to people. And I was particularly interested by one of the presentations earlier, where it showed the difference between the management perceptions of safety and the people on the tools, as they were called, perceptions of safety. And I think we try our very best to speak to the management, but we also really try very hard to speak to the people on the tools. And actually, that's probably about the end of where I'm going to try and get to in the next few minutes. That speaking to people and finding out and understanding their lived experience of what it's really like doing this work in this context, and understanding what their challenges are. So I've started with the end, which is never great, but what I'm going to talk to you about is the role of fatigue management in offshore safety culture. Everyone so far has been focusing on safety culture, and really I wanted to bring a bit of a focus to what role fatigue management and understanding fatigue can play in enhancing safety culture. So I think it's probably useful to start with fatigue and exploring and explaining why I think it's so important, why it matters, and why we should take it so seriously. It's a familiar experience to us all, and I've just observed in the room, after several talks of us all sitting still, listening, focusing, and attention, the energy in the room starts to drop, and it takes a few moments. We've all got up and walked around and had a drink, and everybody's sort of engaged again and invigorated. And that's almost a little sample of what goes on with mental fatigue. And it's an experience that's familiar to us all. It's a natural, normal experience that's part of normal, everyday working life and life in general. It's characterised by subjective tiredness, and there's also this often subconscious shift towards low effort processing. And that's incredibly important, this sense that we start to withdraw effort and look for easier ways of doing things. And this is fundamental in its role in safety and accidents and near misses. The thing about fatigue is we can compensate for it. We can keep working through it. When we're tired, if it's important, we can keep on working and keep on working. And when we're in a safety critical scenario, any sort of working context where safety is at risk or the demands are very high and very important to us, we can work in extraordinary circumstances and overcome and compensate for these feelings of tiredness that we have. But the reality is that this comes at a cost, and the long known costs, we've understood about what these costs are for 60, 70, 80 years, in fact, since the 1940s and the work of Bartlett and the Cambridge cockpit studies, for any of those that are familiar with the human facts history. We know that when people are tired, if they carry on working, they have subtle shifts in their standards. And if you think about characteristics of driving, I always think that's a good example of what the breakdown is and the changes in the way that people engage with the world when they're tired. So shifting standards might be something like you start tolerating greater deviations from the white lines in the road. And secondary tasks might be you start narrowing your focus more towards the really central things that the central elements of your task, and stop doing more peripheral elements, which can actually be things like attending to alarms and so on. Looking at a driving example, looking at your pressure gauge or your petrol fuel or something like that. But it's these strategy shifts and these subconscious, typically subconscious, shifts towards lower effort and actually higher willingness to take risks and cutting corners, that really it's these things in the circles that underpin the relationship that we know fatigue has to accidents. Can you hear me all right back there?
Will you tell us it?
Sorry, I'll maybe speak slower. So we know that when people are tired, they are more likely to take risks, and we know that this plays an important role in the occurrence of important incidents and near misses. Okay, so the argument for why fatigue matters isn't a difficult one to make at all. And it's long been established as a risk in safety. When you think about many major incidents, and there were a whole series of incidents listed in one of the earlier talks, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, the Texas disaster, the Chernobyl disaster, Deepwater Horizon, investigation of all of these historical and some more recent incidents have brought out a catalogue of underpinning failures within the organisation, which have really helped to understand safety and safety culture and how we can develop our safety culture and what we can focus on to improve the situation. And in fact, investigations like these that I'm sure you're all very familiar with have had a huge impact on the way that we understand safety and our understanding of fatigue. What happens when people are tired? What happens to the way that they engage with tasks at night and so on? So, in particular, the most recent one of those, Deepwater Horizon, has had a strong role, and the investigators involved in that particular incident has had a strong role in the development of fatigue risk management plans. They're now recognised as best practice, however, they're still not really very commonplace. When they exist, they often include a statement of intent. So what it is we mean when we say fatigue management, what it is we're interested in, who do we include in our fatigue management plan, what are we going to focus on, how are we going to very typically limit working hours, what are we going to do to make sure our people don't work on days that are too long or shifts that are too long, shift periods that involve too many days of working without breaks and so on. Best practice would be that they incorporate an open reporting culture. So when there's an incident or when there's a near miss that relates to fatigue, that people that are in that environment are supported when they report this, and it's seen with an open mindset and a just culture, as mentioned earlier. And this really feeds into this sort of spiral, this virtuous circle, if you like, of, well, if we start with policies about fatigue, and that helps establish the role of fatigue in our safety culture, and then that influences the way that people will talk to us about fatigue, we can start to really influence that climate. And then when occasions happen where fatigue has a role to play and has been a part of an incident or a near miss, it then feeds back in a sort of evidence-based way into better policies and practices. So that's the general principle of fatigue risk management plans. However, it's my view that they tend to be quite limited in scope. My background is fatigue, my PhD was in fatigue, and I'm particularly interested in fatigue as more than one thing. It's a multi-dimensional concept. It's not just about sleep. It's not just about getting the right number of hours sleep. You know very well, just as people who work, if you work very long hours, it doesn't matter if it doesn't affect your sleep. You can be fatigued. If you were asked to do physical and mental tasks under difficult conditions, you would be fatigued irrespective of how that affects your sleep. So I think sleep is a really important element of understanding fatigue, but we need to take account of the wider things that can make us fatigue. What is it in your particular industry and your particular organisation which makes people tired? What do we need to include in this? And my view is that we need to look way beyond just sleep patterns and the excellent research on shift systems and limiting fatigue by limiting the number of hours people work and so on, but we need to take a wider look. And I think particularly industries like the maritime industry, you've got the standard industrial challenges of long working hours, heavy physical work, things like climbing and lifting. I've done a lot of work in offshore wind, and climbing is a really important physical challenge, and yet that's not part of the fatigue risk management plans. And if you climb up many, many turbines in a day, the the chances of you being in a safe state to carry on working towards the end of the day, it's quite unlikely. So we've got lots of challenges in the maritime industry, but we've also got lots of unique challenges. Environmental stresses tend to be higher. The exposure to heat and cold and noise, motion sickness is an important and unique element of this industry. And also interesting psychosocial challenges like isolation or close confinement, living in very small confined conditions with people you may not get on very well with, and the lack of privacy that often goes along with maritime work. And there's this whole picture to all the things that will contribute to fatigue that mean that standard fatigue risk management isn't enough. It needs to be broader. Okay, so I've already said fatigue's complex. It's not just about sleep, mental demands, emotional demands, sleep disturbances, obviously, and environmental factors can all give rise to fatigue. If all of those things can work individually or together to make people tired. And also, each of those different fatiguing factors, has different after effects. So if we think of the example of a CTV-based technician who goes out to a wind turbine, climbs up a turbine and then gets back on a boat and goes back to the next turbine and does a piece of work out on the next turbine and climbs up again, climbing would have quite different after effects and costs to something like working at a desk under extreme time pressure, which is also very fatiguing, but they have different sorts of after effects. And the truth is, the picture is incredibly complex. I was just having a conversation in the break with a colleague at the back, saying that people don't really understand it, and the truth is, we know what conditions can make people tired. And we know, in general, what it is that happens to people when they're tired. What we know about fatigue now is what we've known for 70 or 80 years. People get a subjective state of tiredness, it's pretty speaks for itself, but they shift towards risky and low-effort, corner-cutting sort of behaviours. The difficulty is, it's incredibly difficult to predict. It's really very hard to say when person X will get tired, will they get tired on this given day? That's actually really very difficult to work out. But what we can do is take a more bespoke approach, and I think Stephanie's going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Just very briefly, these were two experimental studies that we carried out at the University of Hull. They were quite complicated, there were a lot of elements to them, but the point I wanted to make was to show you that fatigue is multidimensional. Fatigue isn't just caused by sleep disturbance. Subjective fatigue after mental work on the left, not surprisingly, created a much stronger sense of mental tiredness than it did physical tiredness. And if you get people working physically hard, that has a much bigger effect on their sense of physical fatigue. So it's complicated, it's multidimensional. If you're interested in either of these experiments, one of the references is at the bottom, the other one's getting ready for publication at the moment. But please feel free to give me a shout and I can talk to you more about it. So, importantly, and I realise I'm probably running over time, the problem with asking a lecturer to speak is that we usually talk for 2 hours, so I shall try not to. What does that mean to your industry? We know that maritime and offshore work is safety critical. We heard the very interesting keynote speech at the beginning about fires and the fact that nobody will come out there and save you. We know how challenging this work is, we know how dangerous this work is, so it makes it even more important that we take fatigue into account and that we include in our safety culture and our developing safety cultures a fatigue risk management plan. So that would be my first very strong message. Please think about fatigue in your safety policies and safety practices. Also, please don't limit it just to sleep. Think about different things within your unique setting. What is it in your industry that makes people tired? And then think about that. Think about, well, as a group, what could the risks be if people were tired in this particular scenario? And it's around that kind of dialogue and that exploration that you can start to think about how to control and mitigate or mitigate against the fatigue risks. One last point I wanted to make is you can either do this as an industry, or you can do it as an organisation, or you can even do it at the team level. So there's lots of different ways you can do this. There's lots of different approaches. I've done this I've done some work in this area about fatigue, understanding fatigue risks at an industry level. I'm a principal investigator in a project called SPOUT, which stands for Safety and Productivity in Offshore Wind Technician Transit. You'd think after 3 years I'd know that better. But it's a huge multi-million-pound project with UK and Dutch partners, and we've taken an industry focus to looking at the implications of rough transit for wind turbine technicians, offshore wind turbine technicians. So we've looked at vessel motion, focused on vessel motion and shift patterns, and we've then tracked their subjective fatigue through the day and over the course of a shift. And the aim of this is for the industry to start to make better regulated decisions that are actually based on evidence and human factors evidence about what impact this environment has on the individuals working in this context. But this is an industry-wide project. We've got many major partners, and the aim is to develop an open access decision support tool that's available for the industry. However, you can do this at an organisational level. You can start to think about reviewing what are the sources of fatigue in your organisation. What is it here that makes people tired? And the only way to do that, in my opinion, is to ask them. You can ask them in very structured ways with questionnaires and measures, or you can interview them or have focus groups, but use techniques to ask people on the tools, what is it that makes you tired? What is it that you think are the dangerous points of your day or your work? What do you think we can do about that? How do you think we can control that? And having these conversations is the starting point, but then to develop a mature policy and a set of practices, you need to keep developing your understanding. So then review this as you go forward. What can we do to control that? And how can we support it with the way that we deal with incident reports? How can we openly and take a just culture approach to the way that we, when somebody reports they're tired or somebody reports a near miss, let's be open about it, and then we can use that information for continuous improvement. And it's only by doing this and reviewing and engaging that you then have the opportunity to develop a mature fatigue risk management plan that's fit for your organisation or your industry, depending on where your focus is. So in very brief summary, fatigue is incredibly complex. I've been working in this area for 20 years, and we still don't understand it. One of the big things we don't understand is how the different sources of fatigue come together. And if as researchers we don't have a clue, we need to go on an organisational basis. What's happening to your people, and take it from the bottom up. I think understanding fatigue is particularly important in this sort of safety critical high risk industry. And when you are developing a fatigue risk management plan, see it as a developmental process, not as a one-off task that's a set of rules that sits somewhere in a drawer. Okay, thank you very much. I think